Goran Vranešević, who is an assistant professor and research fellow. His main areas of research include German idealism, political philosophy, linguistics, structuralism, and psychoanalysis. He has written and taught on topics far-ranging from aesthetics and cultural theory to classical commentaries on ontological issues, and so on. He's also a translator of philosophical works, including one of the translators of Hegel's encyclopedia into Slovenian. He's currently co-editing an edited volume on the idea of the good in Kant and Hegel and preparing a monograph on the concept of speculation. Please.
Thank you. Okay, I'll just go straight to the point. As already indicated in the title, the talk will deal with a topic of seemingly marginal concern in Spinoza and Hegel, sexual difference. This is a matter that could be tackled in various ways. In certain regards, sexual difference might be simply subsumed under the heading of the necessity to ensure societal reproduction. In others, one could try to wrestle this difference from any form of natural conditioning. Or in a more contemporary approach, it would be, of course, possible to try to reinscribe difference into difference. But why Spinoza and why Hegel? What both authors have in common is in fact that they seem to treat sexual difference as a fundamental ontological issue. As Matheron paraphrased Spinoza, quoting him, sexuality is no more intended to ensure the perpetuation of species than eyes are made for seeing or teeth for chewing. And the same is true for procreation, which is only possible because of sexuality, not vice versa. Spinoza's whole disposition of substance and attributes seeks to answer the question of how we can think difference within the absolute and the kind of difference that concerns the absolute. In formulating the sexual difference, we will not follow the justification of the two sexes on the basis of biological determinations or ideal states of masculinity and femininity, but after pointing out the structural discrepancies of the way each sex is inscribed in the social fabric, rather think of the underlying difference as a political problem of the relation between substance and subject. So why are Spinoza and Hegel suitable partners to confront this issue? Spinoza and Hegel have a surprising number of similarities. First and foremost, the belief that life under the guidance of reason is what is most beneficial for man. And although all men are committed to the freedom of mind, as Spinoza was found to point out, and Hegel similarly highlighted the virtue of thinking that separates man from animal, women are within their system always and everywhere in a position of inferiority. While Spinoza argues in the political treatise that, in quoting him, women do not have the same rights as men and must yield them, for Hegel, women are confined to the family, private life, and excluded from public sphere of work and politics. Quoting Hegel from Philosophy of Right, the sexes are plainly in a hierarchical relation to one another, one the universal, the other the particular. They are not absolutely equal. Rather than simply rejecting such ideas or vehemently defending them as Grotius did in Spinoza's time, we will focus on the logical consequences of excluding women from universality. And in this respect, it is interesting to note that with Spinoza, even the simple sexual drama of jealousy is essentially, quoting, played out between males, while women is just a distracting element. The sexual difference points to a split in the assumed unity or homogeneity of the two sexes, where each is ascribed a certain identity. But rather than indicating the substantive characteristics of each sex, we will, as already mentioned, first explore the premise that sexual difference is really an indication of the exclusion of women from political participation. More precisely, sexual difference can be even read to give rise to politics as such. It is the undoing of the established social ties as inherent to their tying, which is what opens the space of the political. Both thinkers illustrate sexual difference as an authentic metaphysical problem. With Spinoza, this problem could be seen as reflecting the impassibility of the boundary between attributes of mind and body in the finite reason. The distance between both attributes is unsurmountable because there is no common space where they can come into contact. And this distance is only strengthened because, in fact, there is no boundary between them as they coincide in the infinity of substance. Hegel was well aware of this ontological deficit of the negativity of finite reason. He did not resolve this impossibility of congruence in substance by bypassing negativity, but rather by pushing the resulting contradiction to its end and producing the subject. And in this sense, we can speculate the sexual difference is nothing more than this subjectification of the problem of the substance of sex. But let us not jump to conclusions. By considering the influence of the political philosophy represented by Spinoza and Hegel, the issue of sexual inequality, to which both are exposed, is frequently raised in contemporary readings, as it is said to be even the central to understanding the respective theoretical approach. On the one hand, we have Spinoza, who, with practically his last words, justifies the unsuitability of women for political life and denies them rights associated with it. Interestingly enough, the heart of the argument put forward in the political treatise is not premised on an institutional barrier to equality, which would be more in line with the case he is making, but on a natural one. He even takes the view that an institutional barrier would not constitute a compelling reason for us to exclude women from governance. Instead, he uses the following reason, and I'm quoting Spinoza from a political treatise. There has never been a case of men and women reigning together, but wherever on the earth men are found, there we see that men rule and women are ruled. And since this is nowhere the case, one may assert that with perfect propriety that women have not by nature equal right with men, but that they necessarily give way to men, and that thus it cannot happen that both sexes should rule alike, much less that men should be ruled by the women. Since the highest happiness or blessedness can be, according to Spinoza, achieved only through perfecting reason, such a particular historically substantiated claim seems quite inconsistent with his general stance towards reason. In general, Spinoza sees reason and the strength of character dependent on ensuring intellectual capacity and freedom. And freedom, according to Spinoza, means the ability, quoting Spinoza, to exist and act solely from the necessity of its own nature. A pure existence that is, of course, reserved only for God. So the advantage of rational actualization of powers is clear to Spinoza. He argues that, quoting Spinoza again, that nothing is more useful to man in preserving his being and enjoying a rational life than a man who is guided by the reason. Or in a similar fashion, quoting Spinoza again, things are good only insofar as they aid man to enjoy life of the mind, which is defined by understanding. Despite this clear metaphysical premise for rational actualization and freedom that comes with it, women are too, following Spinoza and quoting Spinoza, necessarily give way to men, as they are lacking the virtues of model citizen. They are destined to remain unfree, subservient, and unreasoned. Even their education is aimed at adopting them to a subordinated role. All these characteristics are not posited in the context of aristocracy, monarchy, as we might expect, but the completely absolute state, as Spinoza put it, democracy, which is in a few short sentences in a political treatise introduced through those who are excluded. And those who are excluded are, among others, foreigners, slaves, children, orphans, those who commit crime, and women. Interestingly, he's very precise in the use of legal language when arguing for exclusion from public affairs and freedom. Subjugation to imperio for foreigners, potestate virorum and dominarum for slaves and women, and sub potestate for children and pupils. But as already mentioned, and even more important for our argument, it is only in the case of exclusion of women that the possibility of an institutional barrier even comes up. So on the one hand, the question of sexual difference thus emerges with Spinoza as an inconsistency within his universal demand for rationality of human beings. But a similar, even related sentiment can also be found in Hegel. In the peculiar passages of the Outlines of Philosophy of Right, published in 1821, women are subject to identical treatment or logic, They are excluded from public sphere, affairs of the state, while their activity is reduced or subjugated to the realm of family. Quoting Hegel, the law of women is a law opposed to public law, to the law of the state. And Hegel continues in the additional paragraph, when women hold the helm of the government, the state is at once in jeopardy, because women regulate their actions not by demands of universality, but by contingent inclinations and opinions. And then further, Hegel ends his paragraph with a clear distinction in regards to the capacity to acquire reason, quoting Hegel again, women are educated, one knows not how, by as it were, breathing in ideas, by living rather by acquiring knowledge. The status of manhood, on the other hand, is attained only through the achievement of thought and much technical exertion. So Hegel. Hence the reader, of course, expect a critical attitude towards Hegel's philosophy that is present among various scholars. There are naturally also readings according to which the division that cuts across private and public spheres, so femininity and masculinity, is merely a reimagining of the full social structure of the ancient Greek world, which is represented by Antigone's familial principle on the one hand and Creon's political on the other. However, while the ancients were subsumed by nature, the modern social structure is thought to be subordinated to reason. All the logical tensions of Hegel's position are brought to the surface here and almost merge with Spinoza's thought on the unsuitability of women to be politically engaged. For both Spinoza and Hegel, it is precisely reason that is supposed to be the leveling ground for human beings. And for both, the structuring principle and the main concern was a society motivated to maintain a harmonious life and an empowered communal existence. And this requires a significant degree of civic engagement by individuals. This is the sole means by which the government structure can be maintained and seamlessly function for both thinkers. However, as we had already pointed out, this harmony also requires a certain amount of sacrifice, in this case, accounting for at least half of the population, at least, of course, it's more. Spinoza clearly specifies that, quoting Spinoza, both sexes live in harmony only on the condition that men rule and women are ruled. And while the legal determination of Spinoza's self-determination, and likewise for Hegel, can be achieved by separating from the parents, by becoming educated persons and freely striving for a well-being, this does not seem to be universally given. The legal determination of majority of the population is quite arbitrary, since there is no guarantee that the individual has obtained an adequate conatus or of his or her own individual substance to act independently of other forms of dominion. And Hegel goes one step further. In nature, which is itself made possible by internal structure of Hegel's own system and isn't merely given, quoting Hegel, the natural determinacy of the two sexes acquires an intellectual and ethical significance, so that the principle of freedom itself, in a sense, becomes differentiated. In this regard, it does not seem unreasonable to argue that sexual difference introduces into reason an impasse, an antagonism. The way Spinoza and Hegel address the sexual difference is internally inconsistent until both are read together and understood in relation to one another. In its pure form, if we set aside certain practical implications of the argument, this difference establishes a specific form of social bond whose function is to show that this pure form is missing. Let us now consider the preconditions that define the possibility of such distinction in both cases. The dividing features of both sexes are not clearly defined, as they are situated at the intersection of questions of nature, questions of man, and questions of right. And first, let us turn to Spinoza. For Spinoza, of course, mind and body are not separable, as for instance Descartes, as they embody the same reality in two distinct ways. This has, of course, practical consequences. Thinking of our thoughts also means thinking of our bodies. Body is not special sphere of a great significance in the larger schemes of things. It is embedded in the totality, the whole, the substance as one of its integral parts. And even though the same should apply to human beings, who should be regarded as a completely plain one of the elements in the totality of the universe, Spinoza nonetheless attributes to human beings a specific particularity. They are namely capable of dominating things. And in this respect, the most immediate justification lies in the ethics, where discomfort and resistance to animal domination are not seen as rational by Spinoza, but rather, quoting Spinoza, the domination of animals is an empty superstition and unmanly compassion. This particularity, which Spinoza sees in human beings, despite his own denial of the special metaphysical status, is conditioned by his insistence that the true virtue is nothing but living according to the guidance of reason. Any external justification or demands would only reduce man's power. Only a bond with men that have the same right conditions, conditions their equal treatment. But the same does not apply to lower animals or other things of different nature. This is not an arbitrary decision, as Spinoza is quite adamant that it is done by necessity of nature, by the highest right even of nature. So what excludes animals to partake in the affairs of men is not the lack of autonomous rational will, but the recognition of a difference. If we take, for instance, Descartes, his founding of human community is tied to the rationality that surpasses the confines of the body and the difference that is bound out with it. Meanwhile, Spinoza introduces an additional layer in the form of feelings that differ between different natures. In this example, between animals and humans. And this distinct character of feelings expressed through joys, pains, brings humans together and apart. And in this sense, difference in pleasure is also a difference in nature. And by this logic, we can also infer this also is true for women. As Spinoza put it, quoting Spinoza, if man lived according to the guidance of reason, everyone would possess the right of his without any injury to anyone else. But because they are subjected to the affects, the relationship between sexes is based on a difference, a distinctive character and emotions between both. These specific characteristics are then inscribed into the civil state, which is based on a common agreement. Society can be maintained by trust in one another, which can curtail inconsistencies and changeability of men, to which men are necessarily subjected. It is namely affinities and communalities that enable men or human beings to increase their individual potency. And while the perseverance of man is based on the premise that the more we consider man to be free, the less we can say that he can neglect the use of reason, much of our freedoms consist in recognizing what is outside our immediate control and domination. Social norms themselves are namely born from the interaction of human desires, which means that there is a tension between the determining factors of our freedom, and especially in regards to the question on sexual difference, the ability to resist and refrain from them. Understanding of desire and the effects is necessary to ethical and political flourishing, but crucially also domination. The human nature aims at man's preservation and benefit, but also stimulates the feeling of choice when being dominated. In both cases, we are concerned with desire, which animates our habits, fantasies, hopes, decisions, and so on. And in this way, the actual cause for subjugation and domination are obscured from our understanding, and more importantly, the natural power of or right of human beings is thus limited not by reason, but by every desire. In Spinoza, of course, individuals can express full range of different feelings, for instance, joy, sadness, love, hate, and the like, which are themselves bound by diverse species of objects by which they are affected. This is further connected to desire, about which Spinoza famously argued the following. But desire is the very essence or nature of each man, insofar it is conceived to be determined by whatever constitution he has to do something. So while the desire is the very essence of man, it emerges in conjunction with power, and as such constitutes right. If the basic logic of domination of men over women would be based on pure power of self-preservation, the common perspective would be practically ineffective. And it is true that according to Spinoza, quoting Spinoza, each man has as much right as he has power. And the right as power is limited, with God, of course, being the excluded predicament. However, it only takes a slight difference in power, for the benefit, of course, of men, to make a real difference, to amplify immoderately through, let's say, educational practices, the initial slight difference between men and women, into a constitutive inequality and dependence that make this very power possible wherein women and servants are just alterus iuris. A similar basic educational model can also be found in Hegel. Individuals are brought into interaction with others through being brought up in living through social educational institutions, which are as a whole called ethical life, Sittlichkeit. Hegel envisions the required form of political organization to be one that educates individuals to willingly adhere to the common good, and which transforms individuals' entire motivational structure so that they can cease to be purely self-interested agents that they were from the standpoint of abstract right. Of course, Hegel's main principle within this system is known to be actualized freedom. This is a characteristic of spirit as such, which means that it encompasses not only the objective spirit, where we find the aforementioned argument about the singularity of women, who can only express the singularity through family, but also equally art, religion, and of course, philosophy. This also raises question of whether, in Hegel's world, women are exclusively situated within the categories of ethical and political predispositions that we find in the outlines of philosophy of right, to the family and so on. Of course, needs, passions, desires are also, all of them enter into Hegel's rational system and concretize the structure of obligations in which freedom diversifies its demands. But as Hegel explicitly underlines, it is, quoting Hegel, only as thinking intelligence that the will is generally a will and free. The failure of such capacity lays the ground for the appearance of the slave. Following Hegel, quoting Hegel, the slave does not know his essence, his infinity, his freedom. He does not know himself to be essence. And he lacks this knowledge of himself because he does not think himself. And a similar predicament bestows in Hegel also women who are, quoting Hegel again, capable of education, but are not made for activities which demand universal faculty. And even this capacity for education is stripped down to a coincidental breeding of ideas. Knowledge acquisition as such, which encompasses knowledge of the self, is available exclusively to men. Even the first social necessary condition for freedom in the form of private property is tied to marriage. This is also a prerequisite for recognition to become possible, since others have to adjust their expectations and desires according to the property at hand. A woman is unable to regard herself as free, as she is unable to infuse objects with freedom through usage and formation and consequently be recognized as equal among others. Marriage as a contractual or also non-contractual commitment is also a commitment to obey and serve in this regard with Hegel. Within such social preconditions, any semblance of self-determination is lost. And now these parallel readings of both thinkers would suggest that there is absolutely no space for redemption from this static traditionalist understanding of sexual difference. However, the decision and logical explication of their undertaking is premised on a quite simple political decision in favor of stability. As already mentioned, since men are always subject to affects and passions, society is justified, in Hegel's view, to make certain distinctions as a constitutive assurance of the exercise of freedom of thought and expression. Society is not a corrective measure, but a stabilizing apparatus. This is particularly clear in the conclusion of Spinoza's political treatise. After having clearly defined the parameters within which woman should exist, he gives a rather trivial but essential reason for this necessity. And I'm quoting Spinoza's here. This is actually his last words. If we further reflect upon human passions, how men in fact generally love women merely from the passion of lust, and esteem their cleverness and wisdom in proportion to the excellence of their beauty, and also have very ill-disposed men are to suffer the women they love to show any sort of favor to others, and other facts of this kind, we shall easily see that men and women cannot really rule alike without great hurt to peace. So peace is at stake with Spinoza. The rule of man seems predicated on the servitude of passions, which implies that for the sake of humanity, women are obliged to subordinate themselves, even if this is in contradiction to what it means to be human. But it is this very contradiction that proves to be what makes us human at all in his eyes. In Hegel's eyes, a male-headed family, for instance, also carries with it a stability factor, as this establishes a genuine sense of community, of common interest, and so on. However, it is always the male husband that extracts this common purpose, as only he is able to pass into other spheres of ethical life, where they are recognized as seeking common grounds with others. The decision to excommunicate women from this activity is conditioned by Hegel's institutional system. As Wood put it, different institutions require a social differentiation. Each sphere must have its proper representative. And if this distinction were conditioned on this alone, then we could also imagine a role reversal of both sexes, of course. However, Hegel being Hegel, he additionally introduces a physical characteristic as essential for sexual difference. And in doing so, he, however, I'll end with this. In doing so, he does not introduce an anatomical difference as conditioning social roles, but instead assumes that nature or autonomy adapts itself according to particular reproductive rules. So he makes it the other way around. Okay, thank you.
Questions? Okay, Gregor, please.
Thank you, Goran, for reminding us that the history of philosophy is also a history of horrors. So I suppose my question is, but what is your point then? I mean, we kind of know we kind of know that Spinoza had very bad ideas, that Hegel had some very bad ideas, but I was expecting, at some point you will produce a kind of ha-ha, but then...
No, that is just your naivety, I think. No, the point is, like I said in the beginning, I'm not trying to search for like this great answers that will satisfy everyone here, and we will say we found a solution which will make everyone glad that we are sitting here, we are all equal, and so on. My point was, I think, completely different. It was that the logic that they use is infused in their own philosophical system. And their system, especially Hegel's, also Spinoza's, has some contradictions which usually are not brought up when talking about such specific traits of their systems. And I think this one really shows where these contradictions come about. And these contradictions, I think sexual difference is really good, where sexual difference shows, in a sense, maybe I can use this example, where the system itself is folding on itself. And I think when something like this happens, all these contradictions, antagonisms, and so on, spring out, in a sense. And what to do with those contradictions, that's another question, of course. We can also talk about that. But I think that was what I was trying to do. Maybe just opening up the space to see what is even possible. Your argument was, okay, we see the horrible things that are happening. I was hoping for an argument to see how his logic is somehow embedded into such predispositions. So.
I like it very much, but I think that there is a significant issue of prejudice in terms of Spinoza's almost unconscious prejudice in terms of, so when you see Spinoza's use of the terminology of being womanish, it's always negative. I mean, you see it systematically. I think it comes from some sort of our Roman virtue theory about, you need to be manly, maybe Yes, I mean, so you see Machiavelli, precisely, right? So you see, for example, in his description of the Jews as being womanish. If they were not womanish, they would create their land, their interstate, etc. Now, I don't want to be an apologist for Spinoza. I'm not in this business. I mean, far away from that. But what I'm trying to say is that it's interesting that when his theory sometimes goes against the idiotic prejudice, the prejudice wins. One place, I mean, we discussed before, just before we talk, one place where you can see that, but one other place where you can see that is in precisely this argument at the end of the very end of the political treatise, where he's saying that it cannot be the case that the division of power, that the power will be divided. That's an argument that he takes from Hobbes. But contrary to this view, he thinks that democracy is fine. Right? Spinoza thinks that it's I mean, Hobbes uses the very same argument in order to argue that democracy is wrong because you cannot divide sovereignty. Spinoza seems to say, no, I can live with that. I mean, I'm willing to divide sovereignty in order to have democracy or something like that. He finds a way to go around it, to be more precise. You would expect him to say in the same way that you are willing to have sovereignty divided among the people, why not divide sovereignty also among the sexes? Right? I mean, it's, if you're willing to throw away, but then he goes back to this kind of old adage and saying, no, we should not divide sovereignty or something like that. So again, my lesson from that is just to see how much, a lot of times, even as a person pretty intelligent, pretty able to avoid prejudices and pretty able to avoid common sense, when it comes to issues like gender, he's really just in the state of the passion, the state of the prejudice.
No, definitely. I would agree in that aspect. But we did go, just shortly beforehand, we talked a little bit that there is, in a sense, both for Hegel and Spinoza, there is a problem that they are, especially Hegel. When you look at Hegel, he's trying to not just adjust his picture on how women should be treated, that the role is in family, but he goes all the way down to philosophy of nature. He doesn't just go and say, like, in philosophy of right, you have like this special place for women. He goes all the way down to nature and all the way up to spirit, where every time that something happens with women, it's a specific thing that happens. That's why I think there's some, in a sense, something going on there. I would agree, definitely, that there's prejudice present, definitely. But there's also something else, I would say. Even when Spinoza, what was that, treatise on emendation of the intellect, I think there he says that, in a sense, je ne sais quoi, that women have something. They have something, and he doesn't know what that is. Something in their nature makes them different, and he doesn't know how to adjust his world picture or his logic to that. And he's trying, in a sense, to grasp that. And again, these prejudices are embedded in that, but he is trying to do something with that. And I think that Hegel is trying to do even more with that. And they're both wrong, of course.
Okay, Professor Kobe, then Goran.
There is, interesting enough, not only the logic fails, I mean in the case of women, but often, and in case of Spinoza, I would say even, but in Hegel as well, the capacity to acknowledge the facts, clear empirical facts fails. For instance, it's not the case that when women rule, the state falls. Just look at the existing states of the time. There were women monarchs around the world, and the states functioned perfectly. So even at this level of, so let us put aside reason. Okay, in this case it was set off, but just use your eyes, observe the world, and you'll see that you're wrong. And still the logic prevails, the argument prevails. This is, so it's amazing, and it does touch something real. But to return to Spinoza and Hegel, in Hegel I see clearly that this is not just let's say, miscalculation, although it has the same results, but that it has something to do with his theory of, let's say, how the public space functions. And this is then even more serious because, in a sense, not that he's forced, but he has some arguments that are built into his system that makes him easier to do that, which is, of course, in his own view, a contradiction. But okay, you can see where it logically may come from. But in Spinoza, I can see it a little bit hardly, because, you know, there is this identity of identity and difference, or identity of identity and non-identity in Hegel, which opens the door. And I see a little bit more difficult where that would logically, let's say, if we would search for that, come in Spinoza's case. But it was great. So not to, okay.
No, I would agree. I would agree with Spinoza, especially because we still have time. Okay.
Yeah.
With Spinoza, it's I still find it like really fascinating that his last words are this specific last paragraph is on the equal treatment of women in democracy, and then he says, like, I quoted everything that he says about women and democracy, and then at the end, like, the last thing that I didn't quote is, that is enough of this. And then he died. He told everything about what he had to tell about these discrepancies within democracy, and then he died. So there is maybe, even in his being wasn't able to adjust to the deficiencies of his logic.
Okay, last question, Bojana. Very briefly.
Okay, I'll try. Thank you, Goran, for your talk. Now, this might be just a suggestion or a question. How do you see it? And I'm coming from the perspective of logic and Hegel. So now, why sexual difference and why it is so important in Hegel? Well, I would say the first thing that it is a specific kind of difference. It is a difference where elements cannot be subordinated to each other or fused into any kind of higher unity, and we see that explicitly in the Gattungsprozess. So it's a relation of opposition. It's not difference, it's opposition, and opposition is a stronger term and has to do something with preservation of individuality. So this is why it's important. Now, to go a step further, preservation of sexual difference is necessary because by preserving it, we show differences as differences. This is a kind of functions as a precondition to really grasp the difference in of an individual in her particularity. So, and then we could take again step further and say, okay, now we perceive difference as difference, and then let's start and ask ourselves what were the conditions, like political, social, that that triggered these differences, and how can we change this, or how new social bonds can be constructed. So this just what do you think?
A really nice comment, thank you. I would agree, just to a certain part. I know you remember that Hegel he was influenced by, in the 19th century, the one-sex model was the prevalent model. So in this model, it is stated that both sexes come from the same oneness, in a sense. What happens, why the difference happens, is that, in a sense, one of the organs of one sex not evolve, don't externalize. That's the way he puts it. One of the sexes externalizes, the other ones becomes embedded in it, and that's one of the differences he's trying to think in philosophy of right. But I'm also sure that it is possible to think within Hegel a different difference. This is just one of the differences that he's trying to explicate, and he's very adamant, and I think there he does make some logical fallacies to go to the end and adjust his logic to this traditional opposition between men and women. I think that's maybe one of the things that can be done with Hegel. Read his own position on how sex is structured at the beginning and see what is possible to do with that. Also through logic and so on. Thank you for the comment.
Okay, thank you.